The year is 1946. On the windswept coast of the Isle of Man, at a place called Ballytere, an archaeologist's shovel strikes something other than stone. It is bone. Not just any bone, but a human skull, remarkably preserved in the damp, peaty soil. As Gerhard Bersu and his team carefully clear away the cold earth, a macabre scene emerges from the 9th century. Below a mound marking a Viking Age burial, they find the skeleton of a high-status man, interred in an oaken coffin with his sword, his shield, his spear. A classic warrior's grave, but this is not what chills them. Above him, in the upper layers of the mound, lies another body. A woman, aged between 20 and 30. She has no grave goods, no signs of honor. She has only violence. The entire back of her skull has been sheared off by a single, catastrophic blow from a heavy, sharp weapon, a sword, delivered with immense force while she was still alive. Her body was not placed with care. It was deposited in the grave sometime after the man's burial, covered by a layer of cremated animal bones. Forensic analysis would later identify horse, ox, sheep, and dog, all ritually sacrificed for the master's journey to the afterlife. And her. She was just one more possession, one more offering thrown into the dark. Who was she? Isotope analysis of her teeth, conducted decades later by researchers at the University of Bradford, suggested she was not local. She grew up somewhere else on a different diet. She was a foreigner, an outsider, a captive. Her brutal, unceremonious end, unearthed after a millennium of silence, is not an anomaly. It is a piece of a terrifying, systematic puzzle, a glimpse into the true fate that awaited noble women who saw the dragon-headed longships appear on their horizon. You think you know the Viking Age, a time of exploration, of fierce warriors and sagas written in blood and glory. But beneath the surface of the rune stones and the silver hoards lies a darker economy, an engine that powered the entire expansion, fueled not by gold but by human flesh. Specifically, the flesh of women. When Viking raiders sacked a monastery in Ireland or a coastal town in Francia, they were not just seeking plunder. They were harvesting a resource. The Annals of Ulster, a cold, contemporary record, state for the year 821 that raiders on the Irish coast carried off a great number of women into captivity. The entry is specific. Not warriors, not valuables, but women. This was a calculated strategy. A captured noblewoman was a unique asset with multiple potential yields. First, she was leverage. A daughter of a chieftain or a sister of an ealdorman was a high-value hostage. Her ransom could drain an enemy's treasury more effectively than a pitched battle. While her family scrambled to gather the silver, she existed in a state of terrifying limbo. But ransom was never a guarantee. If the price wasn't met, or if political winds shifted, her value was immediately recalculated. She became a commodity. In Old Irish, a female slave was known as a cumul, and the term itself became a formal unit of currency, equivalent to 3 ounces of silver or a handful of cattle. A human being, a woman of high birth, reduced to an entry in a ledger. This was the cold mathematics of the Viking slave trade, a vast, interconnected network of markets stretching from Dublin to the Caspian Sea, where women of noble blood discovered their lineage meant nothing against the weight of silver. Imagine a morning in the year 845. You are the daughter of a Frankish lord, your world defined by the stone walls of your father's estate, the Latin prayers in the chapel, the intricate patterns of the tapestries you weave. Your future is a carefully plotted map of strategic marriage, alliances, and the management of a great household. You command servants. You are protected by status, by law, by God. Then comes the sound, a horn, low and alien, echoing from the river. Smoke begins to stain the sky. The screams are not those of celebration. Within an hour, your world is gone. The stone walls are breached. The chapel is burning. The men of your household are dead or dying in the courtyard. You are dragged from your chambers, your fine clothes torn, the familiar faces around you replaced by bearded strangers speaking a guttural, terrifying tongue. You are bound with rope that cuts into your wrists, thrown onto the hard planks of a longship among weeping strangers and the reek of bilge water, sweat, and blood. This scene, or one like it, played out thousands of times across the coastlines of Europe. The 10th century chronicler Dudo of St. Quentin described the Northmen as a plague, leaving behind nothing but corpses, ruins, and ashes. But they did not leave empty-handed. They took the most valuable, portable asset, the people. For a noblewoman, this moment of capture was not just the loss of freedom. It was the beginning of a systematic process of erasure, a journey designed to strip away Eve. Rye's last vestige of who she was, to unmake her, to turn a person of rank and power into a thing to be sold. The sea spray on her face was the baptism into a new and terrifying reality, one where her name, her family, and her God had no power at all. The journey itself was the first stage of this brutal transformation. Crammed into the open hold of a longship, exposed to the elements, these women were no longer ladies of rank but living cargo. The sagas, for all their heroic posturing, occasionally offer glimpses of this reality. In the Laxdæla saga, the merchant Hörskuldr buys the Irish princess Melkorka, who is presented for sale among a dozen other women in a merchant's booth. The description is casual, the transaction mundane. This was normal. The ship would eventually make landfall at one of the great hubs of the Viking world, Dublin in Ireland, Hedeby in Denmark, or Birka in Sweden. Archaeological excavations at these sites have unearthed the tools of the trade. Iron collars, shackles, and chains, found concentrated in the harbor districts where the buying and selling took place. These were not for livestock. As documented in the journal Slavery and Abolition, these commercial centers were highly organized nodes in a continental supply chain for human beings. Here, the noblewoman would be put on display. She would be stripped, her body examined by potential buyers, her teeth checked, her limbs prodded. Her terror and humiliation were irrelevant. This was a purely commercial assessment of her value as a laborer and as a vessel for breeding. The Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, traveling along the Volga River in 922, witnessed this process firsthand among the Rus Vikings. He described with horror how merchants would publicly rape their female captives in front of their comrades, a grotesque demonstration of ownership and product testing. For the captured noblewoman, this was the ultimate degradation. Her body, once a symbol of her lineage and the object of careful political negotiation, was now just merchandise, its violation a part of the sales pitch. Once sold, the systematic demolition of her identity began in earnest. The first thing to go was her name. The name that linked her to her ancestors, her land, her very self was replaced. The Old Norse poem Rigsthula provides a chilling lexicon of the names given to thralls: bastard, stumpy, stinker, lout. These were not just nicknames, they were linguistic brands, constant verbal reminders of her new, debased status. Imagine being a woman named Genevieve, a name of saints and queens, and now being forced to answer to a word that means filth. It is a form of psychological violence that precedes any physical blow. Next came her language. Her native tongue, whether it was Old Irish, Anglo-Saxon, or Frankish, was now useless. It became a marker of her foreignness, her otherness. To survive, she had to learn the rudiments of Old Norse, the language of her masters. This linguistic isolation was a powerful tool of control, severing her from her past and making her entirely dependent on her captors. As described in the reference research from the National Museum of Denmark, this process was designed to break the individual's connection to their former life. Her clothing was also stripped away. The silks and fine woolens that signified her noble birth were replaced with the coarse, rough-spun tunics of a slave. In the sagas, this is often a key detail. When Melkorka is purchased, she is described as poorly dressed, a visual confirmation of her fallen state. Clothing in this era was a direct indicator of social rank. To dress a princess in rags was to visually erase her nobility, not just for others but for herself. Every time she saw her reflection, it would confirm the terrifying new reality. The woman she used to be was gone, replaced by this anonymous, ragged creature. Her hands, once accustomed to embroidery or the gentle authority of managing a household, were now plunged into the raw, relentless labor that powered the Viking economy. The primary role for many enslaved women was textile production. Research from Uppsala University's Viking Phenomenon Project confirms that the creation of woolen sails for the massive longship fleets required an almost industrial level of production. A single large sail required thousands of hours of labor, shearing the sheep, processing the wool, spinning the yarn on a drop spindle, and weaving it on a vertical loom. Multiply that by the hundreds of ships in the Viking fleets, and you have an economic demand that could only be met by a vast, enslaved workforce. This was brutally hard physical work. Day after day, for years, her life would be consumed by this repetitive, exhausting task. But it wasn't just weaving. Osteological studies of female skeletal remains from the Viking Age, like those analyzed by Anna Kjellström at Stockholm University, often show signs of extreme physical stress, particularly in the upper body and back, consistent with grinding grain for hours on end with a heavy quernstone. She would haul water from the well, tend the fires, cook for the family that owned her, and clean the filth from the longhouse floor. Norwegian legal texts from the period are explicit. A master had the right to extract any labor he wished from a slave and could punish them with unlimited severity for slowness or disobedience. If you appreciate this level of deep, evidence-based historical storytelling, consider subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these forgotten, macabre histories from the cold earth. Now, back to the Longhouse. The Longhouse itself was an architecture of oppression. Archaeological reconstructions show a clear social hierarchy embedded in the very layout of the building. The master and his family occupied the warm, well-lit center of the hall, near the main hearth. The slaves, according to both saga descriptions and forensic evidence, lived at the darkest, coldest ends of the structure, often sharing their space with the livestock brought inside during the harsh Scandinavian winters. A noblewoman who had known private chambers and servants was now forced to sleep on the dirt floor amidst the stench of animals and their waste, deprived of privacy, warmth, and basic human dignity. This physical degradation was accompanied by the constant threat of sexual violence. As the research of William Fitzhugh from the Smithsonian Institution makes plain, female slaves were, first and foremost, available as concubines. This was not incidental abuse. It was a structural component of the system, an accepted right of the owner. Her body was not her own. It was property to be used at her master's whim. If she became pregnant, the child's fate was sealed by law. Status followed the mother. A child born to a slave mother was born a slave, the property of her owner, who was also the child's father. This created an unimaginably cruel dynamic within the household. The child was a living testament to her violation, and she could watch as her own offspring grew up enslaved in their father's home, serving his legitimate, freeborn children. The genetic evidence of this system is undeniable. Studies published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology on the founding population of Iceland reveal that the vast majority of maternal DNA lineages trace back to the British Isles, while the paternal lineages are overwhelmingly Scandinavian. The math is as simple as it is horrifying. Norsemen took Celtic women and populated a new land with their enslaved offspring. For some, there was a fate even darker than a lifetime of labor and sexual servitude, a fate reserved for the most unlucky, or perhaps for those whose masters required a particularly spectacular display of power, even in death. Ibn Fadlan, in his detailed 922 account, provides the most terrifying textual evidence we have for the ritual of a Viking ship burial. When a Rus chieftain died, his body was placed in a temporary grave for 10 days while preparations were made. During this time, one of his slave girls would volunteer to die with him. This volunteerism was a grim fiction. She was plied with alcohol, dressed in fine clothes, and passed from tent to tent, where the chieftain's men would have sex with her, telling her, "Tell your master I did this only for love of him." On the day of the funeral, the girl was led to the ship that had been raised on shore. There, she was handed over to an old woman known as the Angel of Death. The girl was forced into a tent on the ship containing her dead master, 6 men followed her in and had intercourse with her. Afterwards, they held her down as 2 men pulled a rope tight around her neck. As she was being strangled, the angel of death plunged a broad-bladed knife between her ribs, stabbing her repeatedly until she was dead. Then, her body was laid next to her master's. The ship with its dead master, his sacrificed slave, his animals, and his wealth was set ablaze, a towering pyre consumed by fire and smoke. Ibn Fadlan watched this entire macabre ritual, documenting every horrifying detail. He was an outsider aghast at what he saw, but for the ruse this was a necessary and sacred act. The woman was not a person, she was an attendant, property sent to serve her master in the next world. For centuries, Ibn Fadlan's account was viewed by some scholars as an exaggeration, the lurid fantasy of a civilized man encountering barbarian rites. Then, archaeology began to provide the grim, physical proof. We returned to the grave at Ballytere on the Isle of Man. The young woman with the back of her skull sliced off by a sword blow, dumped unceremoniously into the mound above her master. Her death was not a quiet execution. It was a violent, public spectacle, a ritual killing that perfectly fits the pattern of retainer sacrifice. She was not alone. At Flakstad in Norway, the grave of a high-status individual Kanta. In multiple other bodies, all decapitated. Elise Naumann, an archaeologist at the University of Oslo, analyzed their remains. DNA testing confirmed they were not related to the primary burial. Isotope analysis of their teeth revealed they came from different regions and ate a poorer diet. Less meat, more fish, the classic signature of a slave. This pattern repeats across Scandinavia. Graves containing a wealthy, well-armed master accompanied by one or more violently killed individuals who are genetically unrelated and nutritionally deprived. The convergence of evidence is chilling. The forensic record from the bones tells the same story as the horrified words of an Arab diplomat written down 1,000 years ago. The sagas, too, hint at this practice, though often in a more mythologized way. They speak of thralls being killed at funerals to serve their lords in Valhalla. But the bones, stripped of all saga glamour, tell the unvarnished truth. This was not a hero's death. This was the slaughter of a human being who was considered no more valuable than the horses and dogs sacrificed alongside them. For a captured noblewoman, this was the final, terrifying possibility. Her life could be extinguished not for any crime, not in battle, but simply because the man who owned her had died. Faced with such a hopeless and brutal system, was resistance even possible? Open revolt was suicidal. The Icelandic Landnámabók, or Book of Settlements, records an incident where a group of Irish slaves led by a man named Dufthacker rebelled against their master, Eirleifr. They killed him and fled to a nearby group of islands. The murdered man's foster brother, the famous Ingolfur Arnarsson, hunted them down and slaughtered every last one of them. The islands are still known today as the Vestmannaeyjar, the Westman Islands, named for the Irish Westmen who died there. The message was unequivocal: organized resistance would be met with total annihilation. Yet, resistance could take other forms, quieter, more personal acts of defiance. In the Laxdæla saga, the captive princess Melkorka pretends to be mute for years, denying her captors access to her voice and her story. It is a form of passive resistance, a way of controlling the one thing they cannot physically chain. She secretly teaches her son, Olafur, her native Irish tongue, an act of profound cultural preservation in the face of erasure. This was defiance. It was a way of planting a seed of her own identity in the next generation. Other acts were smaller, almost invisible, a deliberate flaw woven into a sail, a misunderstood order, a quiet song hummed in a forbidden language when no one was listening. These were microscopic rebellions, but they were proof that the spirit had not been entirely broken. If you find this exploration of hidden resistance and forensic history compelling, share this video with someone who needs to see it. These stories are too important to remain buried, but for these small acts of agency, the punishment, if discovered, would be swift and brutal. A beating was the least of it. A lifetime of misery could be made infinitely worse by a vengeful master. What of the lucky ones, the women whose families managed to pay the ransom? A Portuguese charter from 961 tells the story of a nobleman, Amerlo Mastalas, who spent 2 years selling off his lands to raise the silver needed to buy back his three daughters, Saria, Ermesenda, and Faquila, from a Viking warband. He succeeded. They came home. But what home did they return to? The documents are silent on the aftermath, but the social realities of the era are not. A noblewoman's value in medieval society was inextricably linked to her perceived purity and her suitability for a strategic marriage. A woman who had been a cumul, a slave in a pagan camp for months or even years, was considered damaged goods. Her reputation was shattered. The very act of paying the ransom was a public advertisement of her ordeal. The community knew. Her father's crippling debt was a constant, visible reminder of her shame. Could she still command the respect of her household? Could she secure the high-status marriage she had been raised to expect? It was highly unlikely. She would live as a ghost in her own home, forever tainted by what had happened to her. Her captors had not only stolen a period of her life, they had stolen her entire future. She was trapped in a liminal state, no longer a captive but never truly free from the consequences of her captivity. This was its own kind of life sentence, a psychological prison from which there was no escape. The silver had bought back her body, but her place in the world had been lost forever. Her return was not a victory, but the beginning of a long, quiet, and lonely exile within the very walls that were supposed to protect her. This vast, transcontinental system of human trafficking, which had defined so much of the Viking Age, did not last forever. Its decline in the 11th century was the result of a single event, but a slow convergence of powerful forces. The most significant was the gradual, and often violent, Christianization of Scandinavia. While the Church did not immediately abolish slavery, its doctrine fundamentally opposed the enslavement of fellow Christians. Raiding established Christian kingdoms like England and Ireland became theologically problematic. The slave trade did not stop, but its focus shifted eastward, towards the pagan Slavic and Baltic peoples. The ideological justification for the old system was beginning to crumble. At the same time, the political structure of the Viking world was transforming. The age of independent chieftains and privateering sea kings was ending. In Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, powerful, centralized monarchies were emerging. These new kings, like Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, sought to monopolize violence and control trade. They wanted to tax merchants, not compete with freelance raiders. This consolidation of power made it increasingly difficult for the large-scale, private slaving expeditions of the 9th and 10th centuries to operate. Furthermore, their victims were learning to fight back. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under Alfred the Great and his successors built a network of fortified towns, or burhs, and established a standing army and navy. In Ireland, Irish kings began to win decisive victories against the Norse settlers. Raiding was no longer a low-risk, high-reward venture. The cost in ships and warriors began to outweigh the potential profit from slaves and plunder. The cold, brutal economic calculation that had driven the machine for 3 centuries was no longer adding up. The engine of the Viking Age was running out of fuel. The Viking Age ended, but its ghosts remain. They are written in the DNA of modern populations, in the unexplained archaeological remains in the cold earth, and in the deafening silence of the historical record where the voices of these women should be. The story of the Vikings is almost always told as a saga of men, warriors, explorers, kings. But this other story, the story of the thousands of noblewomen who were captured, commodified, and consumed by the Viking machine, is the dark matter of this world. It was the invisible engine that drove the expansion, the enslaved labor that wove the sails, populated new lands, and generated the wealth that we now see displayed in museum cases. They were women like Saria, Ermesenda, and Faquila, whose names only survive because their father bankrupted himself to save them. They were women like the anonymous victim at Ballytere, whose story is told only by the sword cut on her skull. And they were the countless thousands of others whose names are lost forever, who vanished from their homes in Francia, Ireland, and England to become property in a strange and brutal land. They are not footnotes to the Viking story. They were its fuel. Their systematic erasure from the heroic narrative is the final, and perhaps most lasting, act of violence committed against them. To remember them is to understand the true cost of the silver and the hoards and the true horror that often lay behind the carved prows of the dragon ships. Their fate was terrifying, not because it was chaotic, but because it was a system, calculated, efficient, and ruthlessly complete.